Good afternoon. First of all, happy Hanukkah. Everybody has and I'm a proud D3 committee member, and I'm happy to see you here. So I'll go and introduce the session is about the national security of Israel and the Jewish people. So I signed up for it. I think I guess you all are very interested in the subject and what the panelists are going to say. So what does the security of the Jewish people stop in Israel national security do? Are there instances when we are in conflict? How do diaspora relationships rank in Israel national security? And is growing estrangement between the Israelis and Jews worldwide on the central threat of the world. I want to just remind everybody that most Jews supported Obama on his on the deal with Iran. So it's actually the first time that there was a separation between the U.S. Jews and what the security in Israel felt as that. Not to say pro or con, I'm just saying that was the first time that actually the Jews in the United States did not exactly align with what Israel thought that was essential for the people. So the panelists are Dr. Alan Mendoza, is a co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. And say hi. A little louder. Leading think tank fighting for the principles and alliances of society. Dr. Yoaz Hendel, I'm sure people look at Israeli TV, you saw him many times from there. He's an Israeli military historian and journalist serving as the chairman of the Institute for Zionism and Society. Melanie, Roth, Gorelick, the senior vice president of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, JCPA. And Dr. Tal Becker is a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Shalom Institute in Jerusalem and a leading member of the Institute I Engage project. Moderating the panel is Eran Shayshon, CEO of the Roth Group, which is a partner of the D3.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very late for the technical issues that made us start late this session. And as the CEO of the Roth Group, I'm very happy to be here, very happy that you all came here. Thank you for that. We're very proud of this partnership with the JCC in Palo Alto. And since we don't have a lot of time, I'll just kick off this session by telling you a story, or maybe it's an urban legend that in Israel, that Shaul Mofaz, the Israeli Army Chief of Staff, between 1998 and 2002, received a draft report of an assessment of Israel's security doctrine. And the only comment he had on this report, which he made with a pen, was add the word national before the word security. So it was a reassessment of Israel's national security doctrine. And I believe this is a very telling indication of a prevalent mindset in Israel that synonyms national security concept with the security doctrine and the use of force. But that's not always the case. There are many countries in which national security is being perceived in a much broader context. Context that relates to ideology, to national goals, to fundamental ethos, to issues, political security, and even social issues that are at the core of the political structure. At the same time, in Israel, there is no articulated official doctrine of what national security means. There were several attempts to articulate it, but nothing formal came out of a few attempts. There's the famous book of Yigal Allon. But that gives us the freedom in this very session to interpret as we feel suit what national security is. And what I would like to ask the panelists to refer to the impact of national security issues on, the relationship between Israel and world Jewry on national security, whether it's whether national security is being depicted as contributing to the actual physical ability of the State of Israel to defend itself, or in a much broader context, of the fundamental ethos of Zionism as the nation state of the Jewish people. So I'd like to start with the question, how important are the relationship with world Jewry to Israel national security, and why? We'll start with Melanie.
Hi everyone, my name is Melanie Roth Gorelick. Hi, so my name is Melanie Roth Gorelick, and I'm with the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, and we're the network hub of 125 Jewish community relations councils around the country and 17 national Jewish agencies in the United States. And together we tackle the most pressing issues of the day and we build consensus. Our work in the United States over the past 70 years has to engage with the non-Jewish community, civic, ethnic, minority, and other leaders to build a democratic and pluralistic America. And our belief is that by building an America, our ethos, our tikkun olam of American Judaism, that we are ensuring the safety and security of the Jewish people here in America. We're seeing a lot of changes happening right now in the spaces that we work. We all know that there's been growing delegitimization efforts, BDS. We know they're changing demographics. No longer will one ethnic or religious community be the majority in America anymore, or racial community. We know that there are changes in leaders, both in the nonprofit NGO space, in the leadership space, in the faith space. There are new generations that are becoming the leaders of all different areas of the American populace, and we don't all know each other in the ways that we used to when we worked together on the civil rights movement. There's a lot of relationships. There's this new intersectionality, not so new, of how people are viewing issues in America. So either you're part of that or you're not part of it. And so the question is, where does the Jewish community fit in all of this? And also, how does what's happening in Israel, or what's perceived to be happening in Israel, impact on American scene? So one of the major issues that we're concerned about right now, and I believe that we've seen, is that there's been a growing, I'm very cognizant of everything that was said in the plenary session, so I'm sorry if I'm not following everyone's directions, but there is a divide right now that we feel between some of the things happening in Israel and the American Jewish community generally. Now, we know in the American Jewish community there's a huge polarization around Israel. Not only is people perceived to be left or right, but there's so many new Jewish organizations that have popped up in the last 10 years that you can join an organization that completely represents just your view, and then you can have that echo chamber repeated back to you, so that it's made it almost impossible to have any real conversation about Israel, what's happening in Israel, and also finding solutions to whatever the problems are. In fact, if you don't say something that someone else does, if you say something that someone else doesn't agree with you on, you just get labeled and we don't talk about it anymore. And so to me, that's one of the biggest problems that's happening in America, is also polarization. From another issue, and then let's go back to what I was going to say, is that we also see new leaders being elected into Congress and being elected into our party system with different ideas than we're used to in terms of support for Israel. And there are concern by many that what will this mean for the Democratic Party? What will this mean for America in terms of our shared support for Israel? But on that particular note, I have less concern at the moment, because the United States just signed a $34 billion 10-year memorandum for Israel's military security. And I believe that we do have shared values about wanting this nation-state of Israel to exist at the national level, and all kinds of studies confirm that. But where there is a disconnect, I believe, is around Americans' concern about tikkun olam and democracy and the state of Israel's democracy, and also what that means. What is the role of religion in the state? Who's making decisions that impact issues that Americans care most about? as we do our Israel advocacy work, we've always had talking points here in America about, Israel as a democratic state, women's equality there, Arab Israelis have every opportunity there, and yet we've seen over the last several years a pause in the equality wall. We have seen most recently the nation-state bill become very harmful and being implemented against American interests, and speaking out that this will harm the minority people in the country. We, at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, we go to Israel once a year and we take the temperature on some of these issues. And I can't tell you how devastated the Arab-Israeli community is, because on one hand, the Israeli government is giving over tons of money to help them integrate into, they have a Government of Israel Arab initiative to integrate into the economy and have transportation on roads, and at the same time, they make them feel as if they will forever be second-class citizens and take away their language. These are things for being one of the main languages of Israel, and these are some of the things that when we're Americans and we're looking out what's happening in Israel, we get concerned. We in America give so much to Israel. How come they won't? They want to decide how it is that we pray. Why aren't they continuing to protect their minorities? Why are they making us feel less and less that how we feel about the center of world Jewry isn't being implemented or cared about, and it is making us feel separate, and yet we love Israel, and we believe it's the center of world Jewry, the center of our Jewish home, and how can we open up a dialogue to create a place that works for all of us, even though we're not citizens of the country.
Thank you, good morning, and Chag Sameach. I could start with my concerns as Israeli regarding the Jewish diaspora, but I think that maybe the right thing to do is to start with a personal perspective. I grew up in a small settlement 5 kilometers from the Green Line, and I'm a typical Israeli. And when I grew up, I knew that there are Jews overseas, and I knew that there are reforms and conservatives, but I have never seen someone like that. So the first time that, and it sounds funny, and I was historian, and I'm academician, and when I was a kid, I was interested in the Jewish history, and I was interested in the science stories and the Prushim and the Tzdukim and all the different Jewish streams in the Second Temple period, but I couldn't understand deeply the gap between conservatives and reforms and Orthodox and modern Orthodox and liberal Orthodox and open Orthodox. So the first time that actually I saw a Reform Jew was when I was 21, and I went to the officer schools in Israel, and suddenly, and the commander of chief of the officer school, Elazar Stern, which is today a Knesset member and a good friend of mine, he forced us to meet 3 different rabbis from 3 different streams. And this was the first time that I met someone that is conservative and looks exactly like me and actually spoke very close to my religious opinion, and then a Reform rabbi and an Orthodox, which is in Israel. Actually, it's including the whole streams together with different types of different versions. And I'm starting with that because I think that as Israeli, first of all, our main goal is to make sure that the state of Israel exists, that we have a homeland for the Jewish people. This is the main priority. And this priority has been there from the really beginning of Zionism. After that, we also want to be sure that we are celebrating today Hanukkah. And there are 2 different, we celebrate the miracles and different narratives regarding Hanukkah, but one narrative we do not mention, and this is the idea that once upon a time, someone like me, who was the third generation for the establishment of the Jewish state, sit in his own home and he was sure that everything is secure and safe. And he was very happy with the strong armies that he had and with the strong economies that he had. And suddenly everything has changed and Pompeius got into the Jewish state. And after 82 years, the Jewish state, the second Jewish state, actually vanished halfway at the beginning, half sovereignty, and then completely after a few years after that. And one of the conclusions from Hanukkah, I think, is to make sure that we are still keeping the miracles that called the state of Israel. So this is in the second priority, how you maintain this miracle, and this is part of the national security. After that, when you put those two priorities, you also understand that maybe when you are 21 and maybe later and maybe before that, and I hope that before that, you also understand that you are not alone in the world, and there are world jury, central world juries in other places, including specifically in the States. And our interest is to make sure that we know how to maintain and how to strengthen the Jewish people in general. And it doesn't mean to give up on the debates and to ignore the gaps on different issues, but it means that to understand that this is part of our needs as a Jewish state, as a homeland of the Jewish people. And I think when we are talking about national security, usually we are focusing on our security challenges and our security needs and our vision regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and other subjects. Part of it is to understand how we keep the checks and balances inside Israel in order to make sure that we have our homeland, you have Israel as a homeland, even those that you live here. And I think that at the end of the day, with all the gaps and with all the debates and with all the what seems very critical national law bill today, and believe me, in 10 years it will be just a historical remark, with all the debates, to make sure that we all agree on, not all, because we are the Jewish people, of course, so we cannot agree about everything, but we can create some kind of consensus, have consensus about priority, about the need of Israel to exist, about what is Zionism, which is not to create a democracy, even though the democracy is very important in order to keep us, to keep the Jewish state alive. We agree that the Jewish people need a homeland, and this homeland should be strong enough to survive many, many years and many, many debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you. And I think maybe I'll start by just picking up where Yoaz actually left off there, because I think the argument, if you like, about the institutions of Israel, the democracy, strengthening it, is one of the connecting points between diaspora Jews and Israeli Jews, because in a sense, what gives us confidence as non-Israeli Jews to speak partly positively about Israel is indeed the fact that Israel shares the values of diaspora Jews, at least nominally in terms of its institutions. When you have a democracy, when you have rule by judiciary, when you have a free press, these are all things that are shared by the majority of diaspora Jews and immediately bring them to a similar conception, at least, of Israel being in the same space as diaspora Jews. And were there to ever be a time that Israel diverted from that, I think that would be a major issue for Israel's national security in terms of how diaspora Jews would view that state. So I think we start from the position that we're blessed in this relationship by having a democratic Israel that respects the same values that we do, and that gives us confidence to support it. But let me take it back a moment to where Eran started, which is this question of national security. Now, he rightly pointed out that national security has many different definitions. And I think it's fair to say that the Israeli state has often viewed it fairly narrowly. It's been viewed very much in the frame of physical security, security of borders, of people in Israel itself around that. And of course, nowadays, as Eran mentioned, there are a number of more expansive looks at things. And the Israeli government, I think, has picked up on this. So, for example, economic security. Can you trade freely? Does that become a factor? And of course, you'll all be thinking of BDS as a sort of notion within that. Well, the Israeli government has certainly recognized that as being a key part of its security going forwards. You've got threats that are international, so terrorism can be international. Now, all of us in America, Britain, other countries have to deal with the concept of terrorism today and how that works. So there is, again, this idea beyond. You can go into the environmental area. Climate change is now seen often as a security issue. You can look at that. You can look at diplomatic security, which is, I think, something fairly unique, though, for Israel, because very few other countries get their legitimacy questioned on a daily basis by a large proportion of other countries in the world. And I think Israel has an issue on that. And I think in many of these areas, the relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel is actually vital to Israel's national security. Because if you have people outside of Israel who instinctively recognize that there is a shared democracy, a shared set of values, when you're trying to make your case for various policies internationally, you will have at least a cohort of people who are predisposed to thinking along the same lines. Now, let me give you an important caveat to this. I don't expect any American in this room, Britain, or anyone else who's not Israeli to put Israel's national security above that of their own country. But it helps again that at least historically, many of the threats that Israel faces are those that we face in the West as well. So to give you some examples, let's look at the issue of terrorism. It's quite clear that Israel's battles with, say, Hamas and Hezbollah, two terrorist groups, which are of course recognized as full terrorist entities here, but not so much in the European Union, these are, of course, threats that our societies in the West face as well, and we have problems from them. We know that, for example, Hezbollah has committed terrorist atrocities in other parts of the world. So it seems obvious that you would have a basis of support for anti-Hezbollah and anti-Hamas activities in the West because you will have similar threats there. And if countries in the West take up, for example, a full prescription of Hezbollah, that happens to help Israel's national security, but it also helps the national security of the countries, of those people pushing for those agendas as well. So you have that. Let's look at diplomacy. In the realm of diplomacy, Israel is a member of the United Nations, and we all may have views about the United Nations, but it would seem to me that the more countries in the United Nations that support an Israeli position on something, because it's the right thing to do, not because it's an Israeli position, is beneficial to Israeli national security. So, for example, if you look at countries that protest against a terrible record of the UN Human Rights Council, which of course singles out Israel ruthlessly in its approach, the USA has led in this by suspending its membership, obviously, of that body. But you can see the impact that when, for example, last year, Britain announced that it was also considering the position based on the bias that was happening, how that becomes relevant to concepts of Israeli national security as well. Now, is the British position determined by the position of Jews in Britain? Of course it isn't. But it's quite clear that a significant cohort of support for this comes from British Jews who recognise quite obviously the hypocrisy of this body and point out to their government how it can support such a hypocritical body as the British state. And that has a relevance within that as well. Look at economic ties. The BDS movement, we know that, for example, obviously Israel and America enjoy a burgeoning trade relationship, but you'll be surprised to know the extent of trade with the European Union. Again, that's vital for Israel's security. When you have BDS movements rampant across the continent, who are going to be the first people likely to speak up against that? It's people who have that connection to Israel and recognize the sense that here's a country, again, shared values, shared democracy, with valuable economic items in the high-tech field, other areas that our country should benefit from, who are willing to make the case. If you lose the support of those communities in making that case, it's going to be much harder to find people willing to bring it to the attention of decision makers who will then look at it on its own merits. So you look at this, and you look at this from the consideration of diaspora communities and Israel, you can see the benefits to Israel of having strong diaspora communities who recognize what is happening in the world and who want to make a difference by bringing to the attention of their own leaders what is going on in international organizations. And from that point of view, the relationship is a strong one. It obviously needs to reflect what happens in Israel, the bits and pieces in terms of the changing political dynamics and what happens. But just purely for the national security conception, it seems obvious that is a strong relationship. It's a relationship that needs to be furthered, and that Israelis would do well to recognize the importance of these relationships when they're considering their own policies, because without the support of a wide raft of countries, Israel really will be isolated, even with the tremendous support of the United States. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Okay, a pleasure to be with you. Thank you it's a pleasure to be on the panel with these wonderful speakers. I was once told that there are 2 rules of journalism: simplify and exaggerate, and I feel like I have to apply that in answering the question in such a short time. But when I think about the question of how important are Israel world Jewry relations to Israel's national security, I think of 3 things I want to say in the few minutes that I have. The first is how important it is to be careful not to analyze this question based on our pre-existing politics. Because what you often hear, I think, in these kind of conversations, a lot of us come to talks like this to hear the kind of eloquent articulation of the position we already have. And you're just waiting for someone on this panel to echo that view, and you nod, and then the person says something that you don't agree with, and then we just walk away, each with our different views. And we're in this kind of moment where words are used, I think, less to persuade people than they are to mark which camp you belong to. And I'm hopeful that this conference is a place where we don't just do that, but we actually open up the ability to push the envelope a bit and think more broadly. At one level, when you ask the question, how important is world Jewry to Israel's national security, there's the traditional answer to that question, which Alan touched on and Yoav touched on, which is, when you think of Israel's national security through the prism of physical security and power and influence and so on, Jews around the world who are advocates for a strong Israel, who see their own country's interests as being advanced by an Israel that is strong and supported. This is the classic way we think of national security, and I think a lot of Israelis think of it in this way, and it still has a lot of validity. It matters whether Jews are important players on the political stage in their own countries, advocates for a strong US-Israel relationship, for a strong UK-Israel relationship, and so on. So at that level, that dimension is still real. And I think Israeli Jews in particular tend to think of this question first through that prism. That's what matters. And if Jews around the world are disagreeing with Israeli policy, they are hurting our national security. If they agree with our policy, that's what they should be doing, because they're strengthening our national security. And that has kind of created a debate around criticism, which essentially sees criticism as an act that weakens Israel. But if you broaden the lens a little bit and you think of national security, Israel's national security, as founded much more on its legitimacy, on the legitimacy of the Jewish state, then a factor in that security becomes the very concept of Jewish peoplehood. Now, Alan was right to say that Israel, probably unlike any other country in the world, seems to constantly have to make the case for its right to exist. And the extent to which Jewish peoplehood as an idea is vibrant and meaningful throughout the Jewish world is itself the underpinnings of any kind of legitimacy for Israel and its national security. So that kind of flips one's thinking about national security on its head, because then what matters to a broader vision of Israel's national security is to actually fight for vibrant, strong Jewish communities outside of Israel whose own sense of peoplehood is rich enough to disagree and criticize, but our strength comes from that ability to be able to have a big tent where a lot of us argue but nevertheless feel that broader sense of peoplehood. And I think that's one of the challenges at the moment, because when Israeli Jews look at the trajectory of American Jewish identity in particular, there's a question that they have about the degree to which peoplehood becomes a defining component of American Jewish identity or is diminishing. And when American Jews look to Israel, there's a question that American Jews are asking along the lines that Melanie asked about values and whether we're really part of the same story anymore. And this leads me to my last point, which I think Melanie touched on, but it's a major, I think, concern and something to think about. One of the things I at least see developing at the moment is that at least a large voice within the American Jewish community and a large voice within the Israeli Jewish community have a different conception of what is required to secure the Jewish future. I think you'll see in Israel today the kind of a dominant trend that is very focused on a strong national identity, on a strong sense of resilience and a strong kind of insistence on the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in a home of their own. And that's the language we use, for example, in the Jewish nation-state law, because a people that feels, I often say that Israeli Jews are a majority who think that they're a minority, right? And the Jewish nation-state law, in a way, is the majority using the tools of the majority to protect itself as the minority it thinks it is. And it feels under assault, and it wants to insist on its national identity and its strength as a solution to what it sees are its security dilemmas. But American Jews, when they think about what is required for Jewish security, they tend to move more to the language of pluralism, tolerance, openness, and a somewhat diminishment of that conception of peoplehood and particularity in a kind of hard sense, because American Jews living in America and Jews living around the world, if they are living in an open society, the chances are the Jewish minority, in the ways that Melanie described, will be safer. And one of the things we need to worry about is whether we are developing different conceptions as to what is actually required for Jewish security. And how do we reconcile that tension? Something I'll talk about a bit in my next session.
Good.
So I want to touch on the last point that Tal and Melanie mentioned, and this is an open conversation. Who wants to pick it up is more than welcome to do that. I want to talk about the other side of the coin. How does the relationship between Israel and world Jewry, the current relationship, compromise or not, the political efficacy, the communal cohesion, and the resilience of the Jewish world? If you want, let's call it a peoplehood security doctrine.
Two things. One is we use the word democracy a lot, so I just want to share that the Israel Democracy Institute came out with the findings of a poll that they did. It came out for me this morning. It said 79% of Israelis feel that they don't have any influence over the policies that are made in Israel. And they're concerned about 57% of the secular people are concerned that their democracy is in danger. And 44% of the Israeli public in general are concerned about that. To me, those are striking numbers. Those are very high numbers. So I think it's something that we need to consider. But what I want to say, and what you were going to say, is that I believe that Americans and Israelis have a lot to teach each other. And one of my concerns that I have, and as you mentioned this, is that Israelis and Americans don't really know each other. And they need to know each other. And they need to learn from each other because they both have different skills. How can Israelis understand what pluralism means to Americans if they don't know people who are Reform conservative, who have different ways of prayer? And on the other hand, that they don't even haven't experienced or seen firsthand what an American democracy is after America has had hundreds of 200 years of trying to figure out what a democracy is. We're not so perfect, and we're protecting it at the moment. But Israel is itself a young democracy. The way, when I came back from Israel, I was there in October, I had a perspective of it that was a little bit different than I've had in the past. I felt like Israel was going out of its childhood, out of, where it was kind of had its parent. America, in a way, was the parent, and we bolstered the confidence, and we supported Israel. We kind of, was the model. This is how you should do it. To now, Israel is kind of like, well, we want to do it ourselves. This is who are we? What is our identity? Besides living here in Israel, who are we? What do we stand for? Do we have an ethos of what we actually believe, besides for our concern about our own safety? Do we have tikkun olam ethics? Do we have social justice ethics? What does it mean to be an Israeli? And how do we, as different Israelis, from Orthodox all the way to Reform, what do we have in common that is shared? It's not an education system. It's not, Israel doesn't have an education system that everyone participates in it. It's not a teaching about civic engagement and that everyone is part of shaping the policies of this country, no matter what your background, religion, faith, etc. So what is it that we have in common? And I think that is where Israel is right now. And my hope is that I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes as Israel becomes into more and further of a mature adulthood, and we as Americans and Israelis meet together as adults to see how we can have a strong world Jewry. Now, I'm not putting down Israel at all. I'm just saying that I see a growth of civil society in every part of society. I see different organizations that are looking at the courts. How can we put and question Israel, some of the laws and restrictions that they're making in the laws through the court system? How can we do it through the Knesset system? How can we do it by building NGOs and nonprofits and others that are teaching ethics and social justice and carrying them out? And how can we bridge and get young Israelis to America to have an experience and get to know each other? So to me, I feel like there's this vibrant percolation of the next generation of questions of self-identity that are going to, as Tal said, if we're looking at the long game, that actually are good things, are good questions, and it's time where it means that we have some security. So instead of always looking at outward to our borders, we can also look inward to try to define ourselves as a nation state that's here to stay.
Thank you. Maybe I will start again with the concerns, because concerns, I think it's part of being a Jew, to be concerned of something. And as I see it, Israel has a very strong democracy, even though that we have so many challenges from a national security perspective, and I mean a local national security perspective. And it brings me to the gaps that you all mentioned before, Tal, specifically you, between two different Jewish approaches to the reality. One of them is Am Levadad Eshkon. Actually, it's a kind of a national identity as you defined it. We should increase and we should define ourselves and we should keep our identity as strong as we can. Why? Because if not, we'll find ourselves in a very problematic situation. The other side, which is also very Jewish, it's a kind of John Lennon view, imagine, of a world without borders, without religions, and on and on. Most of the Israelis, since we live in the Middle East, we don't believe that it's possible to live without borders and without identity and without to live in a kind of utopic idea. We live in a very tough neighborhood, and we understand that without borders and without strength in the identity, we might risk our own homeland, as part of us would say. Now, it's not black or white. It's not 100% protecting the homeland or being a philosophical Jew who have a very beautiful tolerance and accepting everyone and believe in tikkun olam. It's not a gap between tikkun olam or fixing yourself. It's not about being good and being wrong. It's about realpolitik, how you deal with challenges, what is your, how you do risk management in your own place. And I think it's different to do a risk management in Palo Alto than to do risk management in Jerusalem in the middle of the Ramadan period. And this is the real gap and the real deep understanding of Israelis and of Jews from other places. I would like, you spoke correctly about knowing each other, and I would like to finish this part with another small story. 1 year ago, and I wrote about it in one of my columns, I met a group of yeshiva bochers from one of the settlements. And we spoke about our identity as a Jewish and democratic state. This sensitive balance, and as I said, I see it as our previous goal or our main goal in establishing Israel was to find or to create a homeland for the Jewish peoples. And as Churchill said, we didn't have any other, the less worse option was democracy, and we had to do it because Jews without democracy will not survive, as we know from the past. So we spoke about Judaism and democracy. We spoke about different streams in the Judaism, about reforms. And one of the kids, they are not kids, they are 18 years old before the army, he told me that reforms are not Jews. They are not part of the Jewish people as he see it. Of course, he didn't meet anyone until maybe 2 days after that, but in that point of time, he didn't do any reforms at all. And one day after that, I came to Hartman Institute to meet a group of reforms rabbi in order, and what the Foreign Minister office asked me in that meeting is to explain them my perspective about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I belong to the right-wing camp. My risk management is more conservative than liberal regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Religious state, it's something else. I'm a liberal right, what some in the past, the Likud and Begin and Jabotinsky or whatever, you could define them like that. And for 1 hour, I explained them how I see the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and why, unfortunately, I think that the peace agreement, it's a kind of an utopic idea that you can do it only with Harry Potter or another magic stick. And after I finished talking, the rabbi that was responsible for the group took me to the side and he said, look, I have to tell you something. What you said, it's impossible. You said that you are a liberal right. There is no such a thing, a liberal right. And I told him, look, it's very funny. Yesterday, someone told me that there is no such a thing as a Jew, as a Reform Jew. So this is part of the problem and part of the solution.
Well, I want to make 2 points. I think the first one is that we're sometimes guilty of looking at this question monolithically. So here we are going, there's Israel and there's diaspora Jewry. Now, we know that Jews love choice. We love choice. You all heard of the old joke, a Jew gets washed up on a desert island. Several months later, they come and find him and they discover he's built 2 different shacks. And they say to him, what are these 2 buildings? He says, oh, that's my synagogue. And then they say, what about the other one? Oh, I wouldn't be seen dead in that one. The point is, we like a choice. But in many ways, what we're facing is there's only one Israel, there's only one diaspora community. In reality, that's not true. The reality is that in Israel, you can find all sorts of views, all sorts of diversity. In the diaspora, you've got all sorts of diversity as reflected in this room. Although I will say this, there's one group that is missing from this conference. It's not the elephant in the room, it's the elephant outside the room. Where are the ultra-Orthodox? Seriously, you're having a question about Jewish peoplehood and there's no ultra-Orthodox here. That's a big issue in terms of how we're looking at things. But the diversity point is important because if we're to talk to each other as groups, if that makes sense, we'll never find the perfect solution looking monolithically at it. It seems to me we have to break this down to go, which part of Israel suits me as a diaspora Jew, which part of the diaspora suits X as this particular Israeli Jew. I'm like, Tal and Yoaz will disagree, I'm sure, on many things, but do I prefer his view or his view? I can choose. I can be part of that collective. And maybe it's more about cohering around the sort of minutiae of the different groups that will enable us to forge some greater unity in the Z21 paradigm. And I think that may be somewhere to look at. Stop looking monolithic. Let's start recognizing each other's diversity and find the areas within each other's diversity that we want to push for and unify around.
Two things. First, I've noticed that there's some controversy around the current US president. And one of the things that struck me, except for a small voice at the beginning of his presidency, is that most Americans who are very opposed to President Trump don't seem to condition their relationship with America on the president's policies, right? So their love of America and their connection to America is separate from their embrace of the given policies of a government. But something interesting happens to a lot of Jews when it comes to the relationship with Israel, where it seems like the capacity to have a relationship with Israel is in part a function of whether the policies of the given Israeli government is acceptable or not acceptable. It's almost like Israel is not a country but a synagogue. And Netanyahu is the rabbi, and if it doesn't run according if it doesn't run according to your specifications, like the sermon is too long or you don't like the songs, you have to do a breakaway. And I think that's an interesting thing to explore, why it is that our relationship to Israel is more conditional. Many Jews is more conditional in that way. Mark Twain had a wonderful saying about patriotism, that patriotism is to love your country all the time and your government when it deserves it. And I think touching on Alan's comment, Israel and the relationship with Israel is a very broad canvas. And so too, diaspora Jewry is a broad canvas for Israelis. And our tendency to kind of live in a Jewish world where unless people are agreeing with me, I can't have a relationship with them, we're better than that. Which brings me to my second point. So sometimes when you're on the West Coast, especially when you go to campuses on the West Coast, you get a sense, meeting some younger liberal American Jewish students, that the way in which you can be a moral human being is by diminishing to almost vanishing point your own particular identity. Then you can have empathy for others. And particular identity is seen as an obstacle to morality, right? Your tribalism, by the way, if I can be a bit mean, other people's tribalism doesn't tend to be that always, but your own tribalism somehow often is that obstacle. I'm not sure why that is, right? When you go to Israel, or frankly, if you go anywhere in the Middle East, identity is almost the only thing that matters, right? You hold on to it very tightly because there are forces there who are pretty keen to eradicate it, and not just in a debate on a panel. And what you have is these kind of two extremes, one where identity means everything, and the other where identity needs to mean nothing. And what I wanted to say is that a big idea in the Jewish tradition is that identity is not an obstacle to empathy and morality, it is a bridge to it. What happens when you know your own story well, and when you are committed to your own peoplehood, you actually use that as a way to identify with others. And that's the classic story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of course, and the story of our experience in Mitzrayim. And what I wanted to say is that I think part of the challenge here is reimagining Jewish particular identity in a way that's loose enough for us to be advocates of the kind of pluralism, openness, and tolerance that is critical for Jewish survival in so many places, but closed enough so that it matters who we are and that we have a state of our own and that we're serious about defending it. The problem with identity, in my view, is that it isn't really taught. You don't do a PowerPoint presentation on identity and people walk away going, oh, I feel it. It is an experiential thing. It's a thing you have to invest a lot of time and effort in. And that requires, I think, of course, we all agree, spending time with one another more, meeting Israelis, meeting all different kinds of Jews around the world, to get that sense that there is something here worth holding on to and shaping the way we write the next chapter of Jewish history.
I want to give the opportunity to ask, we'll collect 3 questions. Unfortunately, we won't have more time than that. I saw you were the first. Please answer in 2 short minutes or 2 long minutes, still 2 minutes.
So before we were talking about how second efforts, before we were talking about the efforts in United States, UK, and elsewhere, nationally to help Israel, because we all, as Jews in the diaspora, kind of think it's important for Israel to exist. What I think we often miss is that our own ability to live the life that we want is helped by the fact that Israel exists. And I don't hear a lot of talk about that. If you can comment on that, that's the question.
Thank you.
One more question and then we'll...
So I appreciated the comments of Yoaz, well, everybody, about this issue, but it seems to me about the national security of Israelis versus diaspora Jews, particularly in the US, and they particularly came out with the Pittsburgh situation recently, and of course the Trump support, et cetera, but let me focus on the question. It seems to me there's an objective difference of need of national security for Israelis, which is a more tribal situation, really they're threatened on all sides. And so nationalism is kind of a positive thing for their self-preservation, but in the diaspora, particularly in the US, that is not the situation of Jews. Jews have historically thrived in the diaspora, especially the US, in a more pluralistic situation. When you get more nationalism, the minority status of the Jews is highlighted, and it becomes very problematic for Jews to be successful and secure. So we have this, it's not only that the Israelis and the Americans don't understand each other, which is true, the reason is they're coming from different backgrounds, and I'm wondering how you bridge these.
Thank you.
Did you want to answer?
Okay.
One question.
In 2 sentences, right? We have all 2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I think that Israel is still the security policy, insurance policy of the Jewish people in the world. And we need to say it loud and clear, even though that today the US is a center for Jews, strong center for Jews, and safe enough, even after the Pittsburgh event. Secondly, I think that you're right about the gaps between the Israeli needs and the people that live here challenges, and this is part of it. The problems start when I think Jews from, I would say it differently. I have made a lot of criticism regarding the Israeli government and the attitude to different subjects, including church and state and other subjects. But at the same time, I think that the Jews in the US should ask themselves if they are not taking different steps which influence or which criticized Israel in a way that is not really helpful. And I mean, for example, regarding his politics, regarding his policies, regarding even the values, that sometimes from here, as you said correctly, it's much easier to be a pluralist and to be part of something very big and to minimize your own national identity. And in Israel, it's the wrong thing to do because it will work differently.
I just want to respond because I opened up by saying that, America is very, very strong supporter of Israel's security, very strong. And we ensure that we have military and diplomacy and everything in any which way to support Israel's right to exist. But when Americans start actually trying to have conversations with Israeli about pluralism and stuff, Israelis are very defensive and right away say, you don't understand, we don't care about our borders, you're actually saying something negative to us. And Americans hear it, because you're not the only one that I have this experience with. Americans hear it just saying, well, why aren't you listening, echoing back to me what I'm saying so that I know you can also understand what I'm saying, and then we can get into a real conversation, because we are not minimizing your fear or your reality of what's happening in your borders. In fact, we're supporting it with our own, and then we ourselves are having to fight for it in our grassroots in a changing time where you may be making policies that makes it really hard for us to now be included in American society, the growing American society, because the values and things that we actually said Israel was the light unto the nations, you're kind of changing the nature of the game, you're changing the social contract without talking to us, and then we're trying to talk to you, you're kind of saying like, sorry mom, I can't hear what you're saying, but can you drive me to the mall? And that's my best way of explaining this experience at the moment.
Okay, so very quickly, if we look at the two questions, the first one about the security aspect, of course there is a sense, as Yoaz just said, about the safety net aspect of this. But let's be frank, the position of Jews in America or Britain has got nothing to do with the existence of Israel right now. It doesn't, in the sense of it happens because of our own values that enable the flourishing of all forms of minority life within our societies. That's what is there. Nobody is thinking, oh, we better be nice to the Jews because the Israelis might be mean to us in response. That doesn't happen. I do, though, take your point that if there is a crisis for any Jew worldwide, there is this sort of sense that Israel might be there in the wings. But I'll play devil's advocate for a minute. I want to draw the attention of Hungary to you for 1 second. In Hungary, the Jewish community feels very much under threat by some of the rhetoric and actions of the Orban government, particularly around his vilification of George Soros and other things. And yet, Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has come out strongly in support of Viktor Orban. So that leads you to some degree of confusion, perhaps, about how this relates. But it also links into that second question about nationalism, funnily enough. And here's a question of our time. We are now facing the resurgence of nationalism in many cases in our own societies. Forget about Israel for a second, but in our own societies, this sense of we want a more nationalistic agenda. We've had it in Britain with Brexit, for example. You've had it in America with Trump. These things are happening. And a lot of the time, the Trumpians, if you like, and the Brexiteers admire the nationalism of Israel. They look at it and go, here is a country that is loud and proud about what it is and what it wants to achieve on the scale. Why can't we be loud and proud about our own national identities as well? And I think the answer comes in if it's a liberal nationalism or a non-liberal nationalism, essentially. Liberal nationalism, as in the kind historically, classically of 1848 Europe, is something none of us should be scared of. It's something that can be based on values about pride in your country and what it believes in and goes forward in that sort of way, and how you would unite it around liberal values. That's not a problem. It's when the hardline nationalism comes in that's a question. And so to tie it to Israel, I think a lot of this depends on the vision, if you like, of Zionism in whether it's going to be a liberal Zionism or not. If it isn't, then you're going to have problems along the pluralistic line, and if you don't, then you're going to have no problems at all in that respect. So think about it in those terms as well.
Super briefly, on the first question, I think it's a generational kind of gap. For lots of Jews of an older generation, Israel is an insurance policy. For those for whom the Holocaust is memory, not history, the idea that Jewish confidence, the capacity for Jews to stand tall anywhere in the world is a function of Israel's existence seems obvious. But the younger generation, not only are they not convinced that Israel is necessary for their confidence and security, some of them feel that it's a danger to their confidence and security. And that's a huge challenge. And it touches on the second question very nicely. It was something I was trying to say myself in terms of how there are different answers. And I'll pick up on what Melanie said about, I can't hear what you're saying, Mum, but I'll take you to the mall. So I'm over 40 now. But if I leave the house without a jacket on, my mother is cold, right? She says to me, put a jacket on, you're making me cold, right? And I think part of the problem is that the kind of balance between pluralism and nationalism that makes sense in America may not make sense in Israel. And you need a margin of appreciation for the independent grown-up children, both in Israel and in America, to either put their jacket on or not put their jacket on, right? Now, the Jewish nation state law, for example, when it's looked at through American eyes, right, it is something that produces this kind of allergic reaction. But when it's looked at through Israeli eyes, there's criticism of it, and I understand the criticism, we can talk about it, but it's not an earth-shattering document. You can say that it's perhaps, some people think it's an unwise document, it doesn't do the balance right, and so on. But it is not shaking the foundations in a fundamental way, unless you're my mother.
Brilliant.
I know we started late, but unfortunately we'll have to wrap up because we have a time limit. It's impossible to sum up everything that was said here. I will just want to mention a few ideas. Some of them you said, some of them maybe are different, but I can do that because of the moderator. So Israel was established as the nation state of the Jewish people. The fundamental ethos of Zionism was served the entire Jewish people. That was also the basis for still is, the international basis for Israel's legitimacy. So when the international legitimacy of Israel is eroded, then clearly this is a threat to national security. As much as other parts that were mentioned here about how these relationships actually provide security benefits for Israel. But also at the same time, I believe that the Israel factor also erodes the communal cohesion, the efficacy and the resilience of the Jewish world. And I mentioned the Israel factor because sometimes it's many things that maybe the state of Israel is doing that needs to be changed, and we're working to do that. And sometimes, so I say very subjectively, it seems that Israel also has become a work avoidance issue, namely because of Israel, it's a pretext not to deal with several issues that need some leadership. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the panelists for